how is philosophy equipped to start to grapple with the psychedelic experience? And can there be such thing as a philosophy of psychedelics?
Well, I hope there can be, otherwise my career has taken the wrong turn. So I think, I mean, of course, if you ask a philosopher whether philosophy is equipped to deal with something, they're going to say, of course, yes. Why? Well, a number of reasons, I suppose. First of all, philosophy has no presuppositions. It assumes nothing. It's got no foundation base, I mean, according to Schopenhauer at least. So in a way, it's potentially the most open-minded field in which to approach psychedelic experience. I mean, as you know, most conferences on psychedelics are interdisciplinary because no one really knows how to tackle them. So philosophy does that. It gives you an overview, and philosophy as well, of course, can, as part of that, I suppose, can connect disparate fields. So it can connect to neuroscience, to psychology, to theology, to metaphysics, of course, which is one of the main parts of philosophy. I suppose, yeah, another reason is because psychedelic experience seems to touch all of the three main traditional fields of philosophy. So that's then metaphysics, in terms of space and time, eternity, God, unity, Platonism, and so on. Thirdly, the second aspect of philosophy generally is ethics, and there's so much. I mean, there's an interesting case in the papers a few days ago about an ex-British army officer who's been convicted, who might be sentenced to 13 years in prison for hosting an ayahuasca ceremony in Romania. So, the ethics comes in there about, laws relating to cognitive freedom, religious toleration, so on. Philosophy deals with that, of course, ultimately in terms of ethics, meta-ethics. And thirdly, there's epistemology, which means theory of knowledge. And so, the question as to the veridicality of psychedelic visions and so on is an interesting question. In other words, how can we determine whether what we see is hallucination or perhaps whether it has some kind of objective reality to it? So I think in this sense, philosophy has got a lot to offer. And that's why it's kind of surprising that it's, hasn't really been fully established as a field. William James, of course, started off the formal philosophy of psychedelics sort of in 1902 with his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, where he talks about, the famous four criteria, well, famous for me, 4 criteria of mystical experiences, and then includes alcohol as the first step of mystical experience, ether, nitrous oxide, and so on. So, I think philosophy has got a lot to contribute to our understanding of psychedelics.
I'd agree with a lot of what Peter said there. Definitely the idea that psychedelics seem to provide insights to or are in some sense relevant to so many of the questions that philosophers are concerned with, whether it's the question of the fundamental nature of reality or questions regarding the nature of space and time. All of these things play such a prominent role in psychedelic experience. But I've become increasingly skeptical that philosophy is the best means or the best discipline, for want of a better phrase, to study psychedelics. Whilst I think that philosophy is certainly relevant to the study of psychedelics, I don't think it's the best. And I think the reason for that is because arguably philosophy as it's been practiced in the West from at least Socrates onwards, I would say, has been characterized by rationalistic conceptual thinking. Peter mentioned at the beginning that one reason why philosophy is really good is because it doesn't have presuppositions. In that sense, you start from a blank slate. And I think to a large extent that is true, but I think I would argue that philosophy does have a presupposition in terms of methodology, in that it starts with a particular method. And I was, in preparation for this talk, actually just yesterday, I was reading the Phaedo, which is one of the Socratic dialogues. And it's the one where Socrates discusses the immortality of the soul. And he explicitly identifies reason and the intellect as being the primary means to access truth, which for Socrates was the highest good. And I think the problem there is that those who have experienced altered states of consciousness through psychedelics often say that what they've experienced is not just ineffable, but qualitatively goes beyond our categories of thought, so that they simply can't come back and describe in words what they've experienced. And whilst it's certainly true that there are members of the Western philosophical canon, for example, Nietzsche and Heidegger, two who I've done a fair amount of reading into, that's why I mention them, whilst they certainly go against that tradition of rationalistic thought, they are the exception and not the rule. So to give just one brief example, those who've experienced psychedelic states will often come back and say that they experienced a non-dualistic state, where the very distinction between self and other or inside and outside broke down. And what I find interesting is that Edmund Husserl, the founder of a movement in philosophy known as phenomenology, which is essentially a study of the science of the experience of consciousness, he explicitly identified what's called intentionality as one of the key characteristics of consciousness, the idea that consciousness is always directed towards something, that it always has an object. But in a psychedelic state, that intentionality, at least in some states, seems to be wholly absent. So I'd be interested to hear from Peter what he thinks about that.
Well, with regard to intentionality, I mean, I've sort of said that myself. You know, it's interesting that psychedelic states can face that aspect of the mental, thereby it's falsifying many claims as to what consciousness is. But on the general question as to whether philosophy is the best field to approach psychedelics, I don't think I made that strong claim. But of course, to claim otherwise, as you did, is philosophy itself. It's very hard to avoid, you know. I mean, I suppose, I mean, I don't think I'm in disagreement with you really, because I think that, you know, there are limits to rational thought, and certain psychedelic experiences certainly go beyond those limits. However, in terms of, you know, like the apophatic way via negativa, I mean, at least philosophy can show that we shouldn't take any default views as to how we should interpret psychedelics. So, I mean, you know, as some of you know, philosophy can be used to criticize certain foundational worldviews, such as materialism or idealism or dualism or whatever it may be. And so in that negative respect, I think philosophy can be very valuable. But in its positive contribution, I mean, even Schopenhauer says somewhere that, you know, philosophy can reach a certain level after which mysticism takes over. And I think that's essentially what you're saying. And I don't disagree with it. In fact, I've argued the case myself. However, there's an interesting argument to be had as to how the levels of ineffability. So, I mean, I've had experiences which are very hard to put into any kind of like meaningful words. However, I think ineffability, which means, you know, the indescribableness of an experience generally, it has degrees. So, for example, if one's an expert in topology and n-dimensional space, and then one has an experience of n-dimensional space, that person might be able to recognize it as such and explain it as such, whereas someone without that understanding would just call it ineffable. So obviously ineffability is relative to knowledge to a certain extent. But yeah, no, I mean, words will never, Whitehead said something like, philosophy is the attempt to make finite that which is infinite. So of course it is limited because, and you know, this is Kantian, essentially our human minds are limited. This is the great Kantian revolution in a way. So, but then what do you expect of, what does one expect of a field? I mean, could there be a field which can fully comprehend the psychedelic experience? I mean, I know you're an expert in Eastern thought, and
I wouldn't say an expert.
you have an interest in Eastern thought, then let's say, and you know, I've got a lot of respect for that. The Upanishads, of course, Schopenhauer had under his pillow every night, apparently. So it has been influential in Western thought, but even then, I mean, as you know, it speaks in metaphors, does it not? And in the interpretation, and then one has to interpret whether, you know, something is a metaphor or not, as one has to do with the Bible even. So is there any field, is there any discourse which fully captures psychedelic experience? you know, philosophy, psychology, religion, neuroscience, theology? I don't think so. I think we can only go so far. And but I'd still defend philosophy as being, you know, quite well equipped to deal with it, but of course not sufficient, because sufficiency, total sufficiency, would be the experience itself, which is not philosophy.
Absolutely. You mentioned the Upanishads there. Maybe I could take this opportunity just to briefly describe the teaching that's contained in those documents, at least as I understand it, to those who may not be familiar. So the particular tradition that Peter was referencing there is called Vedanta, and it's one of the 6 orthodox schools of Hindu thought. And essentially, Vedanta refers to the end or the culmination of the teachings contained in these spiritual documents that have come down to us through history, called the Vedas, specifically the portion of them called the Upanishads. And to put it colloquially, I would say that the Upanishads are essentially what we would call trip reports in the psychedelic community. They are attempts to describe altered states of consciousness. And again through the Upanishads, you find the theme that these states go beyond what can be described in words and what can be described in terms of the categories of our mind. And so, as Peter rightly said, the sages of the Upanishads often resort to analogies in order to communicate insights that simply can't be expressed through words. And the central teaching of the Upanishads is the idea that your true self, which is called Atman, is not separate from, but is one with the supreme reality, which is called Brahman. And this Brahman is said to have the nature of pure consciousness. And I'd be really interested to hear from Peter on this particular point, because as far as I'm aware, at least in the mainstream Western philosophical tradition, there is no equivalent to this idea of pure consciousness, the idea of consciousness without object. And I mean, I mentioned Vedanta, but more specifically, what I'm talking about here is what's called Advaita Vedanta. And Advaita means not two or non-dual. The idea that the duality and the multiplicity that we experience in our everyday world is ultimately illusory. And this is it's a difficult teaching to sort of get your head around, but I think a helpful way to think about it is to think about dreams. Because when you dream, of course, you experience a whole drama of different characters and you do all sorts of amazing things. And when you're dreaming, you're so absorbed in what's happening that you simply take it as real. You never really for once question it, unless, of course, you're having a lucid dream. And it's only upon waking or awakening that you realize that what you took to be real hitherto wasn't real at all. And all of that multiplicity was really just one self or one consciousness experiencing itself. So I think that at least one of the primary contributions that Vedanta can make to the discourse on consciousness is this idea of non-duality. So what do you think about that, Peter? And do you see any analogues to that in the Western tradition?
I do see some analogues. I just quickly about lucid dreaming. When I was younger, I really wanted to induce it in myself and did all these methods. Didn't really work, but I did once have a lucid dream, and it was, I just looked up this granite facade on a street in the dark and nighttime in the rain, and it said something like E105E, right? It was sort of embedded within the granite. And I was aware, I thought, at last I'm in a dream and I'm quite aware of the fact, right? Anyway, when I woke up, I immediately Googled that code, but thinking it would be something extremely significant, but nothing came up at all. So I'm yet to learn. With regard to non-dualism in Western philosophy, I mean, it's an interesting question. There is a tradition of monism, of course. And so I'll say this on behalf of those people who don't know the Western tradition so much. So the so-called modern father of philosophy and mathematics was a French chap called René Descartes, and he's most famous really for arguing that the mind and the body are two separate things, two separate substances, and known as then substance dualism. And immediately this got into trouble, because how they interacted in the pineal gland in the brain, as he said, was always problematic. How could something which was not solid move something which was solid, and so on. Anyway, one of the it was nonetheless influential, and it was especially because he was a Catholic, and the church, which wielded a lot of power at the time, thought it kind of justified their position of that the soul exists apart from the body, and that therefore it could go to heaven and hell. Although there's a lot of literature as to whether Christianity really is dualistic. I mean, it seems to be more an influence from Plato than scriptural. However, that's another debate. You get people on both sides. Nonetheless, there was this dualism then, and that was actually, I think, very influential in terms of Western science and the Industrial Revolution, because it made everything but humans, I mean, even other animals for Descartes, except magpies, strangely, completely non-conscious, non-sentient. Even dogs had no sentience. So you could, cut them up and whatever, they were just machines, and the whole of nature was completely insentient and so on. And thus, there were no moral qualms in sort of exploiting nature for industrial needs and so on. So that was quite pertinent to the industrial age, but also the methodology of science, which is basically the science of matter, not mind. Mind, or soul, was left then to religion itself. And what seems to have happened in the West, at least, is that we've taken this Cartesian notion of matter as completely soulless to be true, and then we've said, well, we don't need soul, we leave that to religion, and we're atheists, so we just ignore it. But then, of course, that then leads to a cul-de-sac, which is known as the hard problem of consciousness. How do you explain mind in relation to matter, which we can discuss later. So the first real notable philosopher to question that dualism was Spinoza, and he had a monistic system. And this was simply that there's only one substance, which was the universe, which was nature, and he also called that one substance God. So that's why he got into a lot of trouble. He was excommunicated by his fellow Jews, and he was, the state of Holland sort of reprimanded him as well. And because he said, God was nature, it's a form of pantheism, God is nature. And therefore extension, by which he meant matter really, and thought, by which he meant mind, were just two aspects of the same thing. So there was that non-duality there. And it was a kind of illusion of the human mind to believe those two perspectives on the one substance, God, nature. It was an illusion to reify those into two separate substances, as Descartes did, and as a lot of people do through common sense, because, of course, ostensibly, mind has very different properties to matter. Spatialization, extension being the main one, really. So there is that Western tradition of non-dualism in Spinoza. And interestingly, something I'm working on at the moment is something Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God. So he's got this great geometric system in his masterwork called The Ethics. And it's very mathematical in its methodology, and he argues, yes, there's only monism, blah, blah, blah. And in the end, he says, there are three forms of knowledge. There's opinion, which is sort of hearsay. There's reason, which is science, really. But there's a third form of knowledge he calls intuition. And this is beyond reason, as you were saying with regard to the Vedanta. It's beyond reason. The highest peak of that is something he calls the intellectual love of God. But we must remember that he uses God. When he uses God, he means the universe. And by the universe, I should add as well, he doesn't simply mean just mind and matter. These are two attributes of an infinite range of attributes, all of which constitute nature, God. But humans only have access to two of those attributes, mind and matter. So anyway, the intellectual love of God is a kind of ultimate intuition of this total unity. And he says that this is referred to in scripture sometimes as glory, interestingly. Now, this is a very strange part of the ethics, near the end, and there's lots of literature about it, sort of dismissing it, saying it doesn't fit into a system, or trying to make it clear with a system. So it's a very interesting matter. And I'm doing an essay I'm writing an essay and a talk based on that in relation to a drug which is known for its unitive, it's inducement of a unitive experience, 5-MeO-DMT, which is, organically comes from the bufo toad of Mexico. It's the secretion of its venom, really, or poison on its back. So I'm looking at how that psychedelic experience might be similar to that ultimate beatitude, as it were, in Spinoza. And I can tell you more about the 5-MeO experience if you're interested, because that is beyond. I'll just say that. Shocking. Anyway, so there's that Spinozist monism in the Western tradition. And then, of course, that influenced other thinkers such as Schopenhauer to a certain extent, who sort of, did influence Nietzsche, but Nietzsche, of course, went against him. So ultimately, my answer is, yeah, there's a lineage of monistic thought in the Western tradition, but it was never mainstream. It was never really fully adopted by anyone. And the people who did adopt it, I should say, got into a lot of trouble in the West. There was something called the pantheism controversy between Lessing and Goethe and those romantic figures, because someone accused someone else of being a Spinozist, and I mean, I remember reading a biography of Kant, Immanuel Kant, where in Königsberg, where he lived, now Kaliningrad, an enclave of Russia, but if you said you were a Spinozist at the time, early 1800s, late 1700s, you could lose your job, your abode. Your friends will ignore you and so on. It'd be a bit like calling yourself a fascist today. So there's a reason, and you have to therefore bring in the political situation that, they had these religious wars of Europe, which sort of denounced such heretical thought. And of course, the church and the state in Britain were pretty much at one, for most of England's existence and so on. So it's a very complicated picture. But essentially, I think, yeah, there is a strand of monism in Western thought.
I would agree that there's definitely a strand, and that Spinoza is a quintessential example or exemplar of that tradition. But I'd nevertheless maintain that I think there is a difference in terms of methodology here between the Western and the Eastern tradition. And I hate using those terms because they're so broad as to be virtually meaningless. And I must stress that when I'm speaking of Advaita Vedanta, that is just one sub-school of many competing traditions. And so when I say Eastern tradition, you do take it with a grain of salt. But the difference in methodology, I think, is very real, and that is the difference between an emphasis on reason and logic, which you find in Spinoza. As you said, he employed a geometrical, mathematical method in the Ethics, his book, and that contrasts with the much more practical, non-rationalistic methodology we find in the Upanishads, which is yoga, a key portion of which is meditation. I think that, unfortunately, to Western ears, yoga can conjure up images of, I don't know, let's say a middle-class leisure activity which is pursued for relaxation. And there's nothing wrong with that, but in the context of the Upanishads, that's not at all what yoga means. Yoga is an intensely spiritual activity whose ultimate aim is, in Sanskrit, moksha, or liberation, which is the overcoming of ignorance. It's very interesting that in Hinduism, the primary problem for mankind isn't seen to be original sin, but ignorance. And it's the idea that if you realize your true nature as being one with the supreme reality, you will overcome suffering and attain true freedom. But that was often a bit of a tangent. I think it's worth saying a bit about meditation and why I think it's on that. I really see that as a sticking point between the Western and the Eastern traditions, because in the Upanishads, there's simply no separation between theory and practice. Whilst in the beginnings of Western philosophy in Greece, I think the two weren't separate either. To do philosophy was to live the good life, as Socrates says. Over time, that changed. I'm not exactly sure why that happened. I think that Aristotle might have had some influence on that with a more analytic and logical methodology. and jumping right ahead to the analytic school, which is the way that philosophy is done in the Anglo-American world, or predominantly, there's simply no tradition anymore of what, let's put it this way, Socrates wouldn't recognize, I don't think, okay, this might be a bold claim, but I'm going to say I don't think that Socrates would recognize as philosophy what is done today, at least in the majority of analytic departments. So what is meditation? So as I understand it, the sages of the Upanishads turned inwards in search of answers, and they found that by turning inwards, the internal world is as much in flux, it's as much in change, in a play of forces, as is the outside world. And through constant practice and through turning ever inwards and accessing ever higher worlds, as they say, they found that that flux is not the ultimate reality, that underlying it there is an undifferentiated, unchanging, pure, that is non-dual state of consciousness, that precisely because it is non-dual is utterly ineffable. And they called this state the self, the Atman, and they claimed that this was the supreme reality. And the key point that I'm making here is that they reached that insight not through inference or analogy or argument or logic, but through direct personal experience, the mystical. That's not to say that reason doesn't play a role in Indian religious thought. Far from it. There are many dense texts built on arguments and reason, but as I understand it, that discourse is always secondary to or derived from the primary emphasis placed on personal experience. So what would you say about that? Would you recognize a difference in methodology?
Well, I'm not an expert in Eastern thought to really compare. I do remember, I mean, you qualified it, and I remember in this sense that I read a book by Evan Thompson called Dreaming, Waking Being, I think, where he really surprised me in terms of the differing schools of Indian thought thousands of years ago. You know, some of them were akin to our analytic thought today even, you know, so again, it's very hard to generalize, and it's not my field. But yeah, I mean, certainly Spinoza's method is the geometric method was excessive rationality, of course. But then it's interesting, is it not, that such a method ultimately climaxes with this very mystical intuition, literally intuition. So maybe there are, you know, if there is a truth to the universe, you know, then perhaps there are, you know, alternate methods of arriving at that truth. I suppose that an actual experience of it is noetically more valuable than a sort of deduction. I accept that. With regard to I think one of the instigators of the rational thought in the West and logic was Aristotle. Of course, you know, Western thought was based on Aristotelian logic until the 20th century, really, where it was developed, you know, in a very accelerated manner. But you know, Aristotle's sort of responsible for saying, you know, there are substances which are properties and so on. And this is immediate thought, immediately induces this subject-object dichotomy. But do remember, and then Socrates, okay, yeah, you know, he was part of the world. Of course, he got poisoned by the Greek state as well for allegedly spreading false rumors about the gods. But if you read Plato's Apology, which is the death of Socrates, ultimately, he gives them a defense saying that the real reason is he questioned people in power. They didn't like it, so they got him killed. They got the state to kill him. Very much like the Jesus story, in fact, you know, but a few hundred years beforehand. It's very interesting in itself. Another factor here as well is the fact that, you know, all the ancient Greeks attended the Eleusinian mysteries. Eleusis was a town 13 miles away from Athens, and there was a yearly ceremony, ritual really, where everyone could attend, slaves, women. You just had to be able to speak Greek and not be convicted of murder, I think. Otherwise you could attend. And they're called the mysteries because, you know, you were forbidden to speak about them. So our knowledge of them is limited. But people that had to fast, and they had to take a potion You had to go into a hidden, a dark temple, and you know, even Plato writes about in the Phaedrus, for example, visions that one has of the ultimate beauty and so on. You know, in the Phaedrus and some other texts. So there was that mystical element at the start of Greek culture as well. And as you know, Nietzsche spoke about it as well in his first book, you know, Birth of Tragedy. He talks about the Dionysian as opposed to the Apolline elements of Greek tragedy and Greek culture. And there was certainly this mystical element that triggered a lot of Greek thought. Also, you had the Oracle at Delphi, and you had the other Dionysian festivals. Just the Eleusinian mysteries were the biggest of those festivals. So there is an element of this experience in Western thought as well. But what happened, of course, is that, well, the mysteries themselves got shut down by Christian Emperor Theodosius I in the 4th century. They went underground. The Neoplatonists spoke about them a little bit, Proclus, especially the last Neoplatonist. But then it seems to have gone completely underground, and scholasticism took over, and that is basically Aristotelianism in the schools. It got enmeshed in Christianity, perpetrated by St. Thomas Aquinas, and then we had sort of the modern philosophy, as Leibniz calls it, which was then mechanism taking over in the sort of 17th century with Descartes' extension and so on, mathematical understanding of matter. And then, yeah, we have Aristotelian logic in line with that. And yeah, it seems that we did become very alienated from these transcendent experiences that it seems ancient Europeans at least were having and valuing. Why that happened? So many factors. But interesting now in the psychedelic renaissance, we're seeing a sort of return to that. You know, Christianity is becoming hard to believe, you know. I mean, I know there are interpretations of it, but, you know, in its original forms, in its Anglican forms especially, it's becoming very hard to believe. But there still seems to be what Schopenhauer calls this metaphysical need in us, you know. It's not simply a need for superstition. And Schopenhauer was a proud atheist. But nonetheless, he said there was this metaphysical need. And it's interesting that I think the psychedelic renaissance is meeting that need in many ways. You know, it's not creating a religion, but it's creating an understanding from some people that there might be more than just this world around us that we see, this veil of Maya, as you might call it.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting you mention Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer is quite a strange figure in the Western tradition. He's certainly not what we would call a rationalist, far from it, because essentially Schopenhauer turns inwards in search of the answers of the fundamental nature of reality, and he argues that the thing in itself is the will, which is this primordial striving after desire. The other thing that Schopenhauer mentioned in his book, The World as Will and Representation, is that the distinction between subject and object is inextricably tied to knowledge itself, in the sense that knowledge is always divided between a knower and a known. And as you said earlier in the talk, Schopenhauer himself at the very end of The World as Will and Representation says, look, at this point, my philosophy has to stop and take a negative language, the via negativa, because it cannot describe in positive terms what the will, or indeed if there is something beyond the will, truly is like in itself. And I mean, I certainly agree with that, and it's why, to go back to my very first point, whilst I think that yes, philosophy is certainly relevant to psychedelics, I think it can only take us so far, hence my interest in various Eastern traditions at the moment. Just to summarize my position, I do think that there are members of the Western tradition who do buck that trend, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Schopenhauer arguably as well. Wittgenstein would be another. I'm referring to I don't know the later Wittgenstein as well, but I'm referring to the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, who at the very end of the book basically says, you know, once you reach the end of my book, you'll understand my propositions as meaningless, and whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. And as I understand it, the idea is that you work your way through philosophy, you get to the end or the top of the ladder, as it were, and then you chuck it away because you realize that ultimately it can't. The problem with let's put it this way: the problem with metaphysics, I understand Wittgenstein is saying, is that metaphysics tries to say what can only be shown. And I think that the contribution that Eastern traditions like Vedanta can make is that instead of trying to say, Vedanta will show by employing, for example, analogies, or Zen Buddhism, for example, will often employ, I think they're called koans, these paradoxical or contradictory puzzles. And the idea is to sort of get you thinking your way out of thinking, if that makes sense. You ultimately come to understand that thought, precisely by trying to reach the infinite, precisely by trying to answer those fundamental questions, gets tangled up in contradictions. And that's essentially what Kant was arguing in the Critique of Pure Reason, that the reason why philosophy hadn't made any progress in comparison to the great success of Newtonian physics is because in attempting to reach, the fundamental nature of reality and the infinite, or the thing in itself, call it what you want, thought tries to think that which is beyond thinking, hence the contradictions. And so I think when you reach that stage, you realize that what matters are not words, but the mystical silence. And I appreciate that there's obviously a methodological difficulty there. Okay, where can that take us? Where can, you can't communicate mystical silence to the uninitiated by definition. But I think at that point, you just have to accept that, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm just wondering whether we should move on and discuss, maybe you mentioned the heart problem earlier, maybe we could talk about that and see what Western and Eastern traditions and psychedelics could say about that.
Sure. I'd just like to before we do that, I'd just like to say, in this book I'm editing on the philosophy of psychedelics, there's this Professor Steve Odin from Hawaii University who's writing about Zen and psychedelics, actually, and the notion of satori, which is a sort of a experience of nothingness. And a fascinating essay I've read, and I think you'd be interested in it. Yeah, okay, hard problem of consciousness. So this was a term coined by the Australian philosopher David Chalmers in 1995, although it's a very old problem, and it really starts with Descartes, and actually you see it in Aristotle even, if you look carefully in the Metaphysics, for example. But it's essentially this. Well, the way that Chalmers phrases it, I think, is not particularly helpful, because he kind of assumes one way of looking at it. But it's this: how does, very basically, how does mind emerge from meat? How does our experience, colors, sound, smell, emerge from the brain? In other words, neurons communicating with each other via chemicals, in other words, via molecules, in other words, physical things moving. How do physical things moving, no matter the complexity of the pattern, how does that relate to qualia, or experience generally, or sentience or consciousness, whatever you call it? I should also say here, terms are very important, and different philosophers and psychologists will have completely different definitions of what consciousness means, what mind, sentience, experience means, right? But in the broad sense, I like the word sentience because it includes anything subjective. In the broad sense, why the hell is any kind of subjectivity related to physical matter? And one of the reasons why this is a problem is also called, by the way, the explanatory gap. That's what Levine calls it. Much better paper from 1983. But why is there any consciousness at all? I forgot who said it, but someone said that science would be happier if consciousness just simply didn't exist. So it just doesn't fit into the whole framework, right? One of the reasons this is a problem, like I said before, is because we have science, at least science in the English understanding of the word, not Wissenschaft, a much better German word. Science is just focused on matter, and it's sort of pushed mind aside, and then it's come to the point where it says, okay, well, how does mind relate to matter? And then there's an assumption that matter's fundamental and mind is secondary. It's not as fundamental, it comes out of matter. Or either, there's two main materialist views, either mind emerges from matter, there's emergentism, or mind is identical to brain matter, or particular type of brain matter. That's known as psychoneural identity theory. Both of them have massive problems, right? Just very basically, one problem with emergentism is it's not scientific. You know, we know correlates, but we have no so-called bridge laws. You know, there are no scientific laws which show how mind can emerge from matter. There's just correlates. And correlates can mean anything, can mean dualism even, parallelism or idealism. The second, that's upward causation, emergence. The second problem is downward causation or mental causation. In a world of, as physics understands it, with the laws of physics that we currently have, which are constantly changing, of course, there's no role for the mind. So there's one particular belief called epiphenomenalism from Thomas Huxley, really, Aldous Huxley's grandfather, which says that mind is just emerges and it has no effect on your brain or body at all. So that would mean that all your planning, your calculations, your desires had absolutely no effect upon the world. Most philosophers today reject that. They want a place for human intelligence as a factor in contributing to technology and civilization as we know it. And this is what most people would assume, of course. But the problem is, we cannot explain from a scientific framework mental causation. It just does not fit in. It's not a known force of nature. So that's the hard problem of consciousness, just the tip of the iceberg, why it's problematic, how mind and matter relate. My own view is a form of monism, actually, from Spinoza, but ultimately a great philosopher called Whitehead, who's not a dualist either, and has a lot to say about psychedelic experiences indirectly. But my own view is that mind and matter are one, and thus there's only one form of causation. It's not upward or downward, it's identical. But anyway, that's where we are. And this, I mean, I also see the hard problem of consciousness as a kind of real stumbling block for Western understanding. It just doesn't fit in, but it's so essential to our understanding of reality, ourselves and the world around us, consciousness. But it just does not fit into any accepted framework. Some people will say, oh, yes, it does. We've explained it. But of course, no one's in agreement with that, right? So it's a real sticking point. A bit like, I mean, with Newtonianism, you know, everyone assumed that, okay, Newton's worked it out. He's got it all worked out now. There's one little sticking point, the perihelion and Mercury, right? It didn't quite fit in. They said, oh, we'll work it out later with Newtonian physics, right? But it never happened. You had to have this, you know, it's cliche, but paradigm shift. Einstein came along and said, actually, no, you're thinking about it the completely wrong way. And I think this is what's going to have to occur in Western thought. There's going to have to be a paradigm shift where physics and psychology, including philosophy of mind, are going to have to come up with a more unified theory. But that will be then meta-scientific. And that will be perhaps in a few hundred years even. But that's how I see it. That's my understanding. And Matthew, perhaps you've got a different understanding.
So yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there by saying that, you know, nothing is more familiar and more directly known to us than our consciousness, our subjective experience of the world, the taste of chocolate, the color of the sky, the sound of music, etc. And yet there's nothing in our current scientific materialist understanding of the world that can account for that. It would be easier for science of consciousness didn't exist at all. And what's really interesting about the Eastern traditions, again using that term very broadly, is that they have been studying consciousness for literally thousands and thousands of years, of course using a very different methodology and arriving at some very interesting results. Virtually, I think as Peter mentioned earlier at some section of the talk, virtually all the major schools that you will find in Western philosophy of mind were prefigured by these Eastern mystical traditions. So for example, apologies in advance for mispronunciations, eliminativism was prefigured by the Carvaka school, Cartesian dualism was prefigured by the Samkhya school of yoga, and arguably idealism was prefigured by Advaita Vedanta. I'll speak a bit more now about the Advaita position. I mentioned idealism. So idealism essentially is the idea that reality is fundamentally mental in nature, that all that exists are minds and their ideas. But I'm not convinced at this stage whether we can describe Advaita Vedanta as a form of idealism, because recall that the central teaching of Advaita is that the fundamental nature of reality is Brahman, pure consciousness, and that this pure consciousness is arrived at through meditation. And in the Bhagavad Gita, one of the flagship texts of Hinduism, one of the protagonists, Krishna, explicitly refers, I think it's in the Gita, he explicitly refers to meditation as the destruction of the mind. Because for the Upanishads, for Vedanta, ultimate reality does not lie in the changing or the perishable world, it lies in the imperishable. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the internal world is as subject to change as the outer world. Just a 10-minute or a 5-minute meditation session is enough to see that. And it can be a really, not just humbling, but disconcerting experience, because when you meditate, I think you come to appreciate how crazy the mind is. And the idea behind meditation is to try and anchor it and fix it, and to realize that you and your thoughts are not one and the same, that you are not so much an actor in the world involved in the drama, but you are spectating it, as it were. And so the teaching of Advaita Vedanta in response to the hard problem is to deny the very presupposition that the hard problem begins with. And that presupposition is that there are two different things. You've got matter on the one hand and you've got mind on the other, and the latter somehow magically emerges from the former. And when you read the Vedic texts, they argue that on principle, there's no way that that can be found. You can try and study the neural correlates of consciousness for 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. You will never find what you're looking for. Because, and I think Peter will agree with me here, no combination of elements which are themselves unconsciousness can give rise to consciousness. And that's what is meant when Vedic sages refer to consciousness as fundamental. That is to say, it cannot be reduced to or explained in terms of anything else. But just to end on this point, I think it's precisely because of this idea of pure consciousness that I'm reluctant to use the term idealism. Because idealism, as I defined it earlier, you might think of George Berkeley and his subjective idealism, the idea that reality is made of ideas and minds. Well, that's at precisely the point at which the stream of thoughts and ideas ceases, where one is said to glimpse or experience the ultimate nature of reality.
Well, yeah, I mean, nothing to contribute to that, really. It's interesting with regard to the neural correlates of consciousness. Most people today seem to think that, once we've worked that out, that will be the explanation. But of course, those correlates present rather than solve the mystery, I mean, we can assume already that there's a perfect symmetry between mind and matter in terms of the brain. That's still, the mystery remains. Why are they correlated and thus in such a manner? Also, it might be the case that they don't correlate perfectly. And of course, we generalize, every single person has a different correlate of what can be said to be the same ideas, sometimes the same qualia. And then you get problems with Platonism and universals with regard to that. So, yeah, no, we are very far from understanding consciousness. That's because we're very far from understanding matter. And Eddington, the guy who sort of proved Einstein, first of all, he referred to this in terms of pointer readings. He says, listen, when we understand matter, we understand only in terms of pointer readings. We'd call it digital readings today, but like atomic mass or charge or spin or something like this. And then we make the mistake of thinking that those pointer readings sufficiently represent the object, whatever it is, right? But of course, there could be much more to the object than that equipment can perceive. And this is the fundamental point of panpsychism, which I did my doctorate on, which is that matter is much more than we humans can perceive, and it has this intrinsic mentality. And again, this stems, in the Western tradition, at least, from Spinoza, Schopenhauer, and also Whitehead. I mean, Whitehead he's kind of coming back into fashion. Alfred North Whitehead died in 1947 from Cambridge. First of all, a mathematician at Cambridge, then he went to Imperial College, professor there, and then he went to Harvard, did his metaphysics. But I mean, he was the 20th century's greatest panpsychist. So the mind and matter were not separate things. And he was an expert in exhibiting abstractions. And by abstraction, I mean, when we understand something in only part of its essence, it's an abstraction or reification. And because he was a mathematician, he realized that mathematics was completely based on abstractions, of course, numbers and letters and whatnot. And but then he applied it to matter itself, and thus he overcame this hard problem of consciousness by saying, yes, exactly, you know, we shouldn't think that there are two substances. Again, getting back to Descartes, you know, this is a presupposition that has kind of solidified itself in Western thought. I mean, the whole presupposition of emergentism is dualism, ultimately, even though ostensibly it's a materialist. I mean, materialism is fundamentally dualism in its presuppositions, but it won't admit the fact, of course. Sometimes it calls itself property dualism, but that sort of just betrays the fact. So I think that the West can learn a lot from the East. I myself, I mean, actually, I only got into philosophy, funnily enough, because my father had a book on Gnani yoga, right? And I wanted, first of all, to study Eastern philosophy. It wasn't possible in the 90s. So I thought, okay, second best, Western philosophy. Then I got into the idealist, Kant especially, and thought, actually, you know, this is very interesting in itself. But you know, with psychedelics, yeah, no, there is obviously a lot to look at in the Eastern tradition. At the moment, I'm looking at D.T. Suzuki, you know, controversial figure, but a writer, an English writer on Zen, Japanese, of course, and trying to fit that into the Western canon. Now, why you think? Why even bother about the Western canon then, if the East is superior in terms of understanding subtle aspects of the mind? I think that one benefit of the Western method is persuasion, right? Because, you know, if you said something like, you know, the world we see is just an illusion and it's just a veil and that's the way it is, and I know that because I've had the experience, I've meditated for 20 years, right? And I know, just believe me, people won't believe you. So if the condition that you want to persuade people to your point of view, which you might not, but if on that condition, I think Western philosophy has a good role in giving reasons as to why maybe one should be skeptical of previous positions at least. And also positively, I mean, like I say, you know, with Whitehead's philosophy, especially is pan-experientialism as it's known, there are almost positive reasons to understand the world as we see it as a form of abstraction in terms of both perception and conception. So I'm going to, I mean, I feel like this is a bit of a debate between philosophy and theology in a way, right? But I'm just going to say that I have utmost respect for this Eastern, generally speaking, Eastern point of view, but I still think that, you know, in a Western world, Western philosophy and rational thinking has its role in persuading people.
No, definitely, and I'd agree with that. And listening to what you were saying, this quote from David Chalmers came to mind in one of his articles. He writes something to the effect of, in philosophy of mind, one starts out as a materialist, then becomes a dualist, then becomes a panpsychist, and then an idealist, or something like that. The idea being, of course, that the longer you spend meditating on the weirdness that is consciousness, ultimately you come to the conclusion that consciousness cannot be reduced to the material. And I think where you and I might disagree is, this might be based on my ignorance of panpsychism, because it's not a tradition that I haven't read Whitehead at all, for example, as I can't help but feel that panpsychism is in some form still a disguised or closeted form of materialism, because as I understand it, the panpsychist treats consciousness as a property or a quality of matter, such that consciousness is derivative of or secondary to matter. Whereas to go back to the Upanishads, they say again and again that consciousness is that fundamental underlying essence or reality. That is to say, by its very nature, on principle, it cannot be reduced to or described in terms of anything else. So, for example, when the Karvaka, the material nihilists, deny the existence of consciousness, well, the Vedic sages will say, well, precisely in denying it, you assert its existence. So they get rid of nihilism that way. Then you have the Samkhya school of dualism, which is in some respects similar to Cartesian dualism, in other respects different. And we touched on why dualism doesn't work briefly. And so I guess what I'm getting at is that, you know, the more you study and think about the hard problem, I think the more one comes to appreciate the very presupposition that the problem is based upon is mistaken. And I think that the most logically, well, I'm not sure if I'm contradicting myself here by giving to logic. I think the most consistent position, which makes the fewest assumptions, is idealism. If we can understand idealism to mean the pure consciousness that the sages speak of, I'm just not convinced that panpsychism can reach that conclusion. I don't think it goes quite as far as is needed, as that paradigm shift that you mentioned needs us to go. But perhaps I've misinterpreted panpsychism here.
Well, no, you've explained one type of panpsychism, but the panpsychism of Whitehead, which is known as pan-experientialism, really, is a sub-variety, doesn't make that assumption that it's reducible to matter. Quite the contrary. It actually points out how matter is an abstraction that we should not base explanations, we should not reduce explanations to. So there's a lot, and also there's interesting similarities with regard to Whitehead's notion of God, that there's two aspects of him. There's a primordial nature of God, which is a sort of realm of eternal objects, in other words, a realm beyond the material world. And also there's the so-called consequent nature of God, which is God partaking in every single organism. So what we consider as an individual experience, God will take as one of an infinitude of experiences. And that is his purpose, he wants to experience life in its full, you see. So there's an interesting parallels to be made, and I don't think there's any particularly pertinent papers on Whitehead and Eastern thought. There's one for the future, perhaps. But however, yeah, Karl Popper calls panpsychism and materialism, so does Galen Strawson, but I don't think it's right, you know. But this is a linguistic issue, really. It's a linguistic issue.
Yeah. I think maybe just I'm aware probably Angus wants to open up to a Q&A, but I mean, just very briefly, this is slightly off topic and perhaps more a technical question, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. Specifically about Nietzsche, where would you fit him into all of this? Because when you mentioned the Eleusinian mysteries, there seems to be this tradition that, you know, through using psychedelics, one arrives at a view according to which, you know, the world that we experience is illusory, that the fundamental nature of reality lies in an immortal soul. These are all teachings, of course, that Nietzsche explicitly rejects. And yet you and I both agree that Nietzsche was certainly party to altered states. So, I mean, here's a question for you. What do you think Nietzsche would be like after, you know, dropping acid or something like that? Do you think that would have fundamentally changed his philosophy? Do you think it would have amplified it?
Well, you know, I guess you read my essay, Antichrist Psychonaut, where I do point out Nietzsche's drug use. You know, he took chloral hydrate and opium, which is, you know, psychedelic in many respects, and so on, potassium bromide, probably cocaine, or, you know, in a Javanese narcotic. So in a way, he did have the, you know, he didn't take LSD, obviously, which was, you know, discovered in 1940s by Albert Hofmann, Switzerland. But however, opium does induce psychedelic experiences now, and he wrote poems to the poppy seed, you know, the opium seed, and he talks about inspiration and so on. And also, I mean, we must remember that he started off his career in philosophy after philology by talking about the Greek mysteries, the Dionysian mysteries, and intoxicated Dionysus was the god of intoxication. And then he came back to Dionysus and Beyond Good and Evil, one of his later books. And then eventually, just before he completely lost his cognitive abilities, he was signing off letters as Dionysus himself. He became one with Dionysus. He also identified Dionysus with the Antichrist. But as you wrote in your master's thesis, which I was lucky to read today, you know, he was always, he had this interesting need for the eternal, which was seen in but I think my own view is this, that he was working on, he was against systems. He said, I hate systems in philosophy, right? But my own personal view is that he was working on a system, and it was a metaphysical system. And it was a system based on a return to Schopenhauer, a metaphysical system based on the will to power, because will to power essentially is metaphysics. Despite all of his talks against metaphysics, the will to power as something which underlies all causation, as he writes repeatedly, is thereby metaphysical. So, but, you know, with the eternal return, as you say, you know, first of all, it's a psychological doctrine. Would you wish that this happened ad infinitum? Then he took it a little bit more literally. I think he never reached a proper conclusion with regard to it. I personally don't think you can take that literally, because possibilities are infinite, so they never need to be repeated. And you can bring in Whitehead with regard to that. Yeah, it would be very interesting, you know, had he lived, or at least been sane a little bit longer, because he was working, as I say, on this. He was originally going to call the book The Will to Power as well, which became the name of his Nachlass, you know, the notes, which people are dubious about because they were sort of edited in part by his sister, who was friends with, you know, Hitler and so on, right? Gave him a bad name. But nonetheless, my view is, yeah, that he was working on a metaphysical system. I think it was in part inspired by his drug use. He talks about inspiration in his autobiography, of course, but one can only speculate. But the interesting thing really for me is, I mean, that's a scholarly question. What did Nietzsche mean? What did he believe? You know, the difference between a scholar and a philosopher, as I'm sure you'd agree, is that, you know, philosopher will ask, well, is it, you know, is it the case? I dare not say is it true, but, you know, is this, you know, real, as it were, you know, despite, you know, how would Nietzsche have changed his mind? I mean, as you know as well, the three main periods of Nietzsche where he changed his mind a lot. He was also like quite aware that he contradicted himself explicitly. He was in his later work, though, which I prefer, his mature work from the, you know, from Zarathustra probably, he was very much against mechanism, even though he was also ostensibly against metaphysics. So where does that leave you? Was he an idealist or whatever? He, you know, vehemently opposed Schopenhauer, who was his educator to start with. But usually Nietzsche was very critical of those he was closest to. So he's very critical of Darwin. But of course he believed in evolution, perhaps in not in quite neo-Darwinist sense, but he did. And he was very critical of Christianity. But who was the closest Übermensch for him? It was Cesare Borgia, who was a cardinal of the Catholic Church. So when he's critical of metaphysics, I mean, I think we have to take it with a pinch of salt. So I don't know. I think we lost him too early. Hard to say, but you know, I think he was a very spiritual, you know, if I may use that word, a very spiritual thinker. Spoke about intuition. He was not an atheist, as you rightly put in your master's thesis, not in the traditional sense anyway. Far beyond that. I mean, Nietzsche makes Richard Dawkins look like a bishop. I mean, you know, Richard Dawkins' morality is complete slave morality, according to Nietzsche. I mean, he's got what Nietzsche's great at is showing us how many Christian presuppositions we have in our Western thought. You know,
I've always thought that Nietzsche was writing more with an atheist audience in mind than Christians, so-called atheists. You know, saying you think you've left God, but you still cling to his morality.
Yeah, for 1,000 years, yeah. And it's really interesting, actually. I mean, it's hard. Nietzsche's dangerous reader to read because once you've read him, you see everything in a different light. And discussions that, especially moral discussions that I had around one, you know, on the internet especially, you just can't really partake of. You know, they're sort of, they don't really make sense under Nietzschean eyes. So he's a profound thinker, and you have to be careful actually about what what one says about him. I think, you know, especially with the sort of 20th century history. But nonetheless, much more to be extracted from his thought, as you have done nicely, and yeah, many more things to be said about him. A lot of people have neglected his drug use because they don't want to. A lot of scholars have said, no, this is a serious thinker. He wasn't a drug addict. He wasn't insane. What he was writing was totally rational. So therefore, the whole drug infused philosophy that he speaks of has been neglected for that reason. In other words, because, you know, the history is, you know, he was very popular. Then the Nazis got their hands on him. And then he became very unpopular until Kaufmann and then Deleuze and so on, the French got hold of him and made him more respectable again. But you see, the pendulum swung both ways there. So yeah, still a great writer and a lot to be extracted from him, but a dangerous writer, very dangerous writer, you know, in a good way.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. That's been a really interesting sort of whirlwind through a lot of different topics, but particularly consciousness and how psychedelics relate to that. That was brilliant. So I'll open up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? And if you do, just turn on your microphone and fire away.
Hi, yeah, thanks a lot for a great discussion so far. I was just wondering if you could talk about the ethical implications of a psychedelic or transcendent experience, maybe an experience of non-duality. We see a lot of people go through kind of real transformation in the period afterwards and make real ethical changes in their beliefs, in their behaviors. So I'm wondering what you attribute that to, and what's kind of changing in their deepest ethical beliefs, either from a formally philosophical point of view or a personal point of view.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I've been thinking about it recently, and I don't think I've come up with an answer to it yet, because there's no doubt that psychedelics are that they change you in a way that, you know, a lifetime of books wouldn't change you, and that's obviously going to have an effect on one's ethics and the way one sees the world. You mentioned specifically an experience of non-duality, but of course morality is tied to that distinction between good and evil. When you read the Vedas, it is said that the enlightened sages are beyond good and evil, but precisely because they're beyond duality, that the distinction between good and evil is as much illusory as the distinction between self and other, inside and outside, mind and matter, etc. But these enlightened beings are not beyond good and evil in the sense that Nietzsche's potentially more notorious or nefarious supermen or Übermensch are. And so this is what I'm confused about, and maybe Peter could help me here. These enlightened beings are beyond good and evil, and yet they act very much in a way that we would recognize as essentially the very sort of Platonical Christian ethics that Nietzsche had very little time for, namely seeing the same self in all, feeling compassionate, avoiding envy and anger and strife, because ultimately when, as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, when you see the same self in all beings, when you treat each person you meet as God, why on earth would you waste your time, you know, arguing about, you know, being stuck in a traffic jam, you know, and things like that? So I think there's definitely an ethical change. But the thing that I'm stuck on is it's beyond good and evil, it's beyond that dualism, and yet it seems to be tied so close to a morality that we would recognize, say, the Buddha or the Christ as exemplifying. But it'd be interesting to see what Peter thinks of that.
Okay, two questions then. First of all, yeah, it's quite interesting that about 100 years ago, the speech of mysticism, now I consider mysticism as one part of the psychedelic experience, need not be mystical, of course. He says, Bertrand Russell in Logic and Mysticism writes that a common experience is this notion of seeing things beyond good and evil. So this was well known, and the reason why a lot of people frowned upon mystics, because they got out of the world and they seemingly didn't care and so on. But it is true, and there have been studies on it, that psychedelics can change your values, right? And I prefer to speak about values rather than morality, because morality often signifies an objective morality, and a dogma, as it were, of good and evil and whatever. So, but by speaking of values, one can overcome that, I think. And so, one common change, it seems to me, and there was an imperial study on this, is this heightened respect for nature after taking psychedelics, heightened valuation of nature. The question as to whether that's good or evil is a subsequent question, which one doesn't immediately need to ask. So I think one of the reasons for that, from a Whiteheadian point of view, is this, that Whitehead speaks about two main forms of perception. There's the traditional perception of, you know, the five senses, you know, from Plato onwards, and including proprioception and so on. But Whitehead talks about this other form of perception, which is primal, but in humans pretty much hidden, because our traditional senses overwhelm it, as it were. And that primal sensation is a kind of a real sympathy or empathy with the other. So you know, for example, on psilocybin, I think psilocybin is a particularly good drug for this. One can look at a natural object, a plant, say, and it's not, one has a heightened sense of aesthetic sense of it. You know, it's more beautiful than normal, or it can be, at least. Need not be, but it can be. But also, and so, you know, in addition to that, I find there's a kind of, and something that Aldous Huxley even wrote about in Doors of Perception, because he was basing his philosophy on Bergson, and Bergson influenced Whitehead as well. This notion that the sentience of the other can actually be absorbed. The object can be absorbed by the subject. So there's a kind of interfusion of entities. So what I think, I mean, it's speculative, but what I think psychedelics might be able to do is amplify that general primal sense we have of real connection to nature, real perception to nature. And thus, when one comes out of it, one feels this greater connection. Somewhat akin to the lake poets, you know, the sort of romantic period, you know, Coleridge and Wordsworth and people like that, you know, who seem, their poetry seems to express that as well. And they were big opium users, I should say, right? So, I mean, that's one respect in which I think psychedelics can increase valuation in the natural world. Another one, just quickly, related more to the ontology, the more metaphysics we were speaking about, is this. And I had a student, when I was teaching in London many years ago in a college there, I had a student who came to me, and he's quite quiet to start with. And eventually I got to know him, and he said, the reason he came, I said, why did you study philosophy, right? Because he was this kind of sports star, footballer, you know, Americans would call him a jock kind of person, right? And he said, well, I was, you know, happy-go-lucky kind of guy, and then one day I took this drug, and suddenly I was outside of my body, looking at all of my friends and myself, and then kind of like stuck, and it suddenly completely changed all my presuppositions about reality. One aspect of psychedelic experiences, according to William James, is a noetic quality, which means it's not just perceptual, but you have a feeling that what you're seeing is real. Now that might be lost when you come to remember it later on. You think, actually, oh, it must have been hallucination. But at the time, there seems to be a noetic quality. And this noetic quality comes in degrees, of course. And this student of mine seems to have had it. And suddenly it made him question all of his assumptions about the world and himself, and thus changed him. And I think this is what psychedelics can generally do. I think it gets you out of a kind of set way of looking at the world. In the West, I think it's particularly useful because we have inherited this mechanistic tradition, this materialist tradition, which makes nature completely without inherent value, and it can sort of it can bring in that value again, and that, you know, on top of all of that, sorry if I'm rambling on now, but one more thing, most of the stuff on psychedelic renaissance, so-called, today is about therapy. It's about, oh, can we use psilocybin to treat PTSD or depression or OCD or whatever it might be? And there's another great, you know, in terms of therapy, if we can define therapy as a moral thing, which most people would, of course, then they seemingly can help with that as well. How certain psychedelic, I think that's dependent on the person also, and like, you know, certain psychedelics, I think certain psychedelic experiences are not therapeutic, quite the contrary, you know. Again, the memory of 5-MeO-DMT is hugely terrifying. It can only be therapeutic, I think, in the sense of it just smashing you out of any preconceptions. But if you don't have them anyway, like I don't really, I think I don't, then it's just kind of something sublime and awe-inspiring, somewhat horrific. So we shouldn't lose track of that psychedelics can cause, you know, can be, you know, horrifying as well. You know, it's not common, but it happens.
Just to briefly ask a follow-up question on that. Psychedelics often conjure up this, you know, counterculture, sort of maybe left-wing liberal hippie ideal, as we saw, for example, in the 60s. Do you think that psychedelics are somehow predisposed to move, as it were, people in that direction of the spectrum? Because what I find interesting is that there are examples of people who are very much on the right wing of the political spectrum who experimented with psychedelics. Julius Evola, a lesser known, very controversial right-wing thinker, experimented heavily with psychedelics. And as far as I'm aware, that didn't move him at all to the left. If anything, it actually entrenched his right-wing views, because he saw psychedelics, as I think many who first experimented with LSD, for example, many of the sort of artistic and cultural elite thought that this should be reserved for the cultural elites, and they saw it as sort of a hierarchical or esoteric sort of thing. So do you...
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, Albert Hofmann, who discovered or synthesized LSD, he was center-right. And his good friend, Ernst Jünger, as Heidegger called the true continuer of Nietzsche, was, you know, a captain in the Second World War for the Germans. And he became famous because he wrote a book glorifying the First World War, right? So, so I think, you know, also there were skinheads in the 80s who took LSD to become better fighters, right? So it does swing both ways, as it were. In the 60s as well, with the hippie movement, that was a Marxist movement generally, which then also had psychedelics, so they were intertwined that way. I do think they cause, I mean, it depends how you define left and right, of course. I mean, like if a greater love for mankind, I think they can induce that, and that would generally be seen as left wing. So yeah, it depends on definitions. One thing I'd say though is, I think it's very important to bring all political persuasions to not polarize the debate, because with this psychedelic renaissance, you could easily see the Daily Mail or so-called right-wing newspaper suddenly saying, you know, philosophy doctor advocates, you know, immoral drugs to students, something like that, right? Something I fear quite often. You don't want that to happen. So the latest research that, you know, MAPS are doing, and Imperial College and Johns Hopkins and so on, treating, you know, soldiers for PTSD and the police and so on, that sort of ensures that the right, or people, you know, generally speaking, the right will be sympathetic to that as well. And I think that's a very important thing, because polarization, of course, created the prohibition of psychedelics, really, you know, at least in the 60s. Of course, there was before that, wasn't the start of prohibition. We had the 1908 laws against opium already, and that was due to addiction and so on, and actually anti-Chinese. So, you know, the history is long. I mean, you can go back to, you know, prehistory for these prohibition laws. The prohibitions against witchcraft and so on, somewhat related, and also against heretics and so on. You know, it's very interesting history. But I mean, if you accept, as you were indicating from Russell, that psychedelics impose a kind of transcendence of good and evil, then it can't be left or right. But at the same time, many of the values they do instill are more pertinent to the left, I should say, in general. But, you know, it's very hard to generalize here.
Although I'll just interject there and say, when on firing line with William F. Buckley, Timothy Leary did say that he was more conservative than Buckley was, which is quite interesting. But again, that wouldn't be perhaps the traditional right-wing conservative that we think of, but it's sort of different sort of conservative. Interesting,
yeah. I generally try to avoid politics because everyone talks about it all the time, and I just think it's, you know, interestingly related to Nietzsche. You know, Nietzsche famously said God is dead, by which he meant, you know, the sanction for Western morality is gone. So you'd think then the implications would be then that people become less dogmatic morally, but it seems that that is not the case. There's another interesting sociological PhD or endeavor. But anyway, ultimately, with regard to your question, I think it does instill new values. It changes people. I personally became much more interested in theology after I took psilocybin, my first psilocybin experience. And I became much more appreciative of the beauty of nature, even though I already appreciated it a lot. It did change me, and certainly on the course I'm on today, in a positive manner. And I think it can only have what was generally called positive effects on people. Even a nightmarish scenario, and I've had some of those gothic kind of demonic kind of incidents, even those were very interesting, you know, in terms of looking at the sublime and the gothic in the past. You know, nightmares are interesting. They're not pleasant, but they're nonetheless positive in an interesting way. So, you know, I think, generally speaking, I think they can only be positive for people.
Great. Yeah, Monish, I see your microphone's off. I think this will be our last question. I'm aware it's now it's approaching 9 p.m. So we'll wrap up after this.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for the talk. Firstly, it was quite good to hear. My question is for Matthew. So in the talk earlier, you describe the metaphorical nature of Eastern texts, particularly the Vedas, in explaining states of consciousness. And myself, having been brought up in Eastern culture, I fully understand your view and where you come from that. With that line of argument, do you think the metaphorical texts in the Vedas or even the Bhagavad Gita could have been subject to meanings away from their true messages? And if yes, then could that be one of the reasons behind how Eastern culture sort of distanced itself from the psychedelia subtext underneath the Vedas or the Bhagavad Gita as time went by?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I agree with you that there's definitely a psychedelic undercurrent to Indian religious thought. In the earliest Vedic scriptures, known as the Rig Veda, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the oldest religious text that's still in continuous use today, there's a section that is in praise to Soma, and the identity of Soma to this day remains a mystery. And because simply the knowledge has been lost, we no longer know what Soma was. And it was some sort of liquid that was brewed or produced. Again, the methodology has been lost. And they said that when you drink this Soma, now we can see like the gods see, which sounds rather like someone on an acid trip. So I do think that there was a psychedelic undercurrent. I do think that that has been lost through time. And that idea of losing that wisdom or that knowledge through time itself plays, I think, an important part in Indian thought. We in the West have a very sort of liberal or progressive idea of history. We think that things are always getting better. But in the Vedas, you find the complete opposite teaching. No, things will actually get worse through time as you move ever further away, as it were, from this primordial knowledge or this tradition. So just briefly, in Hindu cosmology, time isn't a straight line, but it's a circle subdivided into different yugas. And I'm afraid to say that we're apparently in the worst one. We're in the Kali Yuga, but the good news is that it's the shortest in terms of length. But it's bad in the sense that adherence to Dharma, to the natural order or way of the universe, is declining. And I think that that's not just a statement that goes through one ear and out the other. I think there's certainly some truth to that. When we look at, for example, the devastation that we're causing to the environment, for example, through our consumerist culture, and I think that Peter was very right to mention how psychedelics can really open up in someone a consciousness or an awareness for the environment that they simply never had before. Again, breaking down that dualism between self and other. So that was a bit of a tangent, but to answer your question, yes, I think that there was that psychedelic undercurrent, and I think that over time that psychedelic or mystical meaning behind those metaphors has unfortunately been lost. But then again, it's always there, I think, to be found by those who are seeking it. And I think I'll end on that note.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you again, Matthew and Peter. That was really interesting. And we've got this recorded, so we'll put it up on our social media once we've had another look at it. So thanks everyone for coming. And we've got 2 events tomorrow. We've got John Danvers, the Buddhist chaplain at Exeter, running a mindful drawing session for us. And then we've got yoga in the afternoon. Cool. So thanks very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, Matthew.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers, Matthew. Cheers all.